The Trail Horde by Charles Alden Seltzer. This is a story of hard country and harder choices. In the open spaces of the American West, law often arrives late, if it arrives at all. What governs men instead are reputation, resolve, and the quiet understanding that weakness invites trouble. What follows is the original public domain text. Now, we begin The Trail Horde. Chapter 1, Concerning Morals. There were 50,000 acres within view of the ranch house, virgin grass land dotted with sage running over a wide level, into little hills, and so on to an upland whose rise was so gradual that it could be seen only from a distance, best from the gallery of the ranch house. The first tang of autumn was in the sage-scented breeze that swept the county and the tawny valley, basking in the warm sunlight that came down from a cloudless sky, showed its rugged beauty to advantage. Cain Lawler paused at the edge of the gallery and filled his lungs from the sage-laden breeze, and then wheeled to face his mother. She smiled at him. "Have you seen Ruth Hamlin lately, Cain?" Lawler's lips opened, then closed again, tightly. And by that token, Mrs. Lawler knew that something Cain had been on the point of saying never would be said, for she knew her son as no other person in the country knew him. Cain Lawler was big, from the broad shoulders that bulged the gray flannel shirt, down the yellow corduroy trousers that encased his legs to the tops of the boots, with their high heels and dull-roweled spurs. Lawler looked what he was, a man who asked no favors of his kind. Mrs. Lawler had followed him out of the house, and she now stood near him, watching him. There was in Lawler's lean face, as he turned from his mother and peered steadily out into the valley, a hint of volcanic force, of resistless energy held in leash by a contrary power. That power might have been grim humor, for his keen gray eyes were now gleaming with something akin to humor. It might have been cynical tolerance, for his lips were twisted into a curious, mirthless half-smile. It might have been the stern repression that had governed him all his days. Whatever it was, it seemed to be no secret from his mother, for she smiled understandingly, and with pride that must have been visible to anyone who watched her. Massed in the big valley, at a distance of 2 or 3 miles from the big ranch house, was a herd of cattle. Circling them were a number of cowboys on horses in the huge corral that spanned a shallow, narrow river where other cattle. These were the result of the fall or beef roundup. For a month there had been intense activity in the section. Half the cattlemen in the county had participated in the roundup that had centered upon Lawler's range, the Circle L, and the cattle had been herded down in the valley because of its natural advantages. There the herd had been held while the neighboring cattlemen engaged in the tedious task of cutting out, which meant that each cattle owner took from the herd the steers that bore his brand, with the addition of a proportionate number of unbranded steers and calves, designated as mavericks. Then the neighboring outfit had driven their stock home. "It was a big roundup, Cain," said Mrs. Lawler, watching the herd. 8,000 head, Lawler replied. "We're starting 1,000 toward Willits today." "Have you seen Gary Warden? Have you arranged with Warden to have him take the cattle?" Lawler smiled. "I had an agreement with Jim Leffingwell. We made it early last spring." "A written agreement?" "Shucks. No, I never had a written agreement with Leffingwell. Never had to. Jim's word was all I ever wanted from him, all I ever asked for." "But perhaps Gary Warden's business methods are different." "I talked that over with Leffingwell when he sold out to Warden. Jim said he'd already mentioned our agreement to Warden, and that Warden had agreed to carry it out. But suppose Warden has changed his mind. Lawler spoke seriously. No man goes back on his word in this country, but from what I've heard of Warden, he's likely to. If he does, we'll drive the stock to Kepler at Red Rock. Kepler isn't buying for the same concern, but he'll pay what Leffingwell agreed to pay. We'll ship them, don't worry. Red Rock means a 500-mile drive, Kane. Lawler replied, You're anticipating, Mother. Warden will take them. Leeler grinned and stepped off the gallery. A few minutes later, he emerged from the stable carrying a saddle, which he flung over one of the top rails of the corral fence. He roped a big, red bay, smooth, with a glossy coat that shone like a flame in the clear white light of the morning sun. The bay was built on heroic lines. He was tall and rangy, and the spirit of a long line of thoroughbred ancestors was in him. It showed in the clear white of his gleaming, indomitable eyes, in his thin, sensitive nostrils and long, shapely muzzle, in the contour of his head and chest, and in his slender, sinewy legs. Man and horse were big, capable, strong-willed. They were equipped for life in the grim, wild country that surrounded them, from the slender, powerful limbs of the big bay to the cartridge-studded belt that encircled the man's middle with a heavy pistol at the right hip. They seemed to typify the ruggedness of the country, seemed to embody the spirit of the wild. Lawler mounted, and the big bay whistled as he pranced across the ranch house yard to the big corral where the cattle were confined. Lawler brought the bay to a halt at a corner of the corral fence where his foreman, Blackburn, who had been breakfasting in the mess house, advanced to meet him, having seen Lawler step down from the gallery. Blackburn was of medium height, swarthy, with heavy brows, under which were keen, deep-set eyes. His mouth was big, expressive, with a slightly cynical set in repose. We're hitting the trail in about an hour, said Blackburn. Are you wanting me to put 'em through, or are we taking 2 days to it, as usual? 2 days, advised Lawler. There's no hurry. It's a bad trail in spots, and they'll want to feed. They'll stand the trip on the cars better if they've had plenty of grass. Gary Warden is keeping Leffingwell's agreement with you, I reckon, asked Blackburn. He eyed Lawler intently. Of course. Lawler caught the expression of his foreman's eyes, and his brows drew together. He added, Why do you ask? Just wonderin', hesitated Blackburn. Just wonderin'. You seen this here man, Warden? Lawler had not met Warden. He had not even seen the man from a distance. That was because he had not visited Willits since Warden had bought Leffingwell's ranch and assumed Leffingwell's position as resident buyer for a big Eastern livestock company. Lawler had heard, though, that Warden seemed to be capable enough, that he had entered upon the duties of his position smoothly, without appreciable commotion. He had heard that Warden was quiet and easygoing, and that as a cattle buyer he seemed to know his business. This information had reached Lawler's ears through the medium of neighboring cattle owners, and he was willing to accept it as accurate, though he was not prepared to form an estimate of Warden until he had an opportunity to talk with him personally. Well, went on Blackburn, them that's looked him over don't hesitate to say he don't measure up to Jim Leffingwell's size. Jim was a mighty big man in size and principles, said Lawler. Now you're shouting. There wasn't no man bigger'n Jim, sideways, edgeways, or up and down. I reckon any man would have a hard time measuring up to Jim Leffingwell. Maybe that's what's wrong with Warden. Folks has got Jim Leffingwell on their minds, and they're not giving Warden what's coming to him, them being biased. He squinted at Lawler. Folks is hintin' that Warden don't own Jim Leffingwell's ranch. Might tall, that some Eastern guys bought it, and that Warden's just managin' it. Seems like they's a woman at the Leffingwell's old place, keepin' Warden company. She's Eastern too, they say. Got a old maid with her to keep her company. A chaperone, they say, which ain't in no ways illuminatin' my think tank none. Which is a chaperone? A kind of a moral monitor, Blackburn, grinned Lawler. Some folks need them. If you're thinking of getting one, bah! Blackburn's eyes were vitriolic with disgust. I say be what you are hintin' at when you gas a morals, which I'm a heap acquainted with because I ain't got none to speak of, but I'm plumb flabbergasted when you go to connectin' a battleship with anything that's got a whole lot to do with morals. According to my schoolin', a monitor is a thing which blows the stuffin' out of. A monitor of morals could do that, gravely said Lawler. In fact, according to the best authorities, there have been many monitors who have blown the stuffing out of the reputations of their charges. Blackburn gulped. He was puzzled, and his eyes were glazed with the incomprehension which had seized him. Twice again, as he watched Lawler's grave face, he gulped, and then he eyed Lawler belligerently. I reckon them monitors is Eastern. I've never seen one gallivanting around these parts. They're a lot Eastern, assented Lawler. I've never seen one, but I've read about them in books, and once my mother saw one, she tells me the East raises them by the 100. That accounts for it, declared Blackburn. Anything which comes from the East is likely to be a heap shy on hoss sense. He now squinted at Lawler, watching him keenly. According to report, Joe Hamlin ought to go around dragging one of them monitors. Blackburn shrewdly noted the quickening of Lawler's eyes and the dull red that stole into his face. What do you mean, Blackburn? Davies and Harris hit town again last night, and coming back, they run plumb into Joe Hamlin. He was in the upper end of the Box Arroyo. He'd roped and hog-tied a Circle L cow and was blotting our brand out. What happened? Lawler's lips were set in grim lines. Nothing, following your orders regarding the cuss. Davies and Harris let him go, after warning him something ought to be done. It ain't addin' a heap to the morals of the outfit for the men to know a man can rustle cattle that promiscuous, and the boss not battin' an eye winker. This is the 4th time he's been caught with the goods, to say nothing of the times he's done it without nobody gettin' wise. And the boys is beginning to ask questions, being a heap puzzled because something don't happen to Joe. Lawler's face was expressionless. Except for the flush in his cheeks, he seemed to be unaffected by Blackburn's words. His voice was a trifle cold when he spoke. I'll attend to Hamlin. I'll stop at the 2-bar on my way to Willits. By the time you reach town with the cattle, I'll have the deal with Warden clinched. Blackburn nodded, and Lawler wheeled the bay, heading him northward. As he rode, Lawler's face changed expression. He frowned, and his lips set stiffly. What he had been almost on the point of telling his mother was that he knew why Ruth Hamlin had refused him. It was pride, nothing less. Lawler suspected that Ruth knew her father was a rustler. In fact, there had been times when he had seen that knowledge lying naked in her eyes when she looked at her parent. Accusation and disgust had been there, but mingling with them was the persistent loyalty that had always governed the girl, the protective instinct, and a hope of reformation. The pride that Mrs. Lawler had exhibited was not less strong in the girl's heart. By various signs, Lawler knew the girl loved him. He knew it as positively as he knew she would not marry him while the stigma of guilt rested upon her parent, and he was convinced that she was ignorant of the fact that Lawler shared her secret. That was why Lawler had permitted Hamlin to escape. It was why he had issued orders to his men to suffer Hamlin's misdeeds without exacting the expiation that custom provided. Lawler did not want Ruth to know that he knew. He sent the big bay forward at a steady, even pace, and in an hour he had crossed the sweep of upland and was riding a narrow trail that veered gradually from the trail to Willits. The character of the land had changed, and Lawler was now riding over a great level, thickly dotted with bunch grass, with stretches of bars, hard sand, clumps of cactus, and greasewood. He held to the narrow trail. It took him through a section of dead, crumbling lava and rotting rock, through a little stretch of timber, and finally along the bank of a shallow river, the Wolf, which ran after, doubling many times, through the Circle L Valley. In time he reached a little grass level that lay close to the river. A small cabin squatted near the center of the clearing, surrounded by several outbuildings in a semi-dilapidated condition and a corral in which there were several horses. Lawler sent Red King straight toward the cabin. When he reached the cabin, he swung off and walked toward the door, his lips set in straight lines, his manner decisive. He had taken only several steps when a voice greeted him, coming from the interior of the cabin, a man's voice, snarling, venomous. "You come another step, Kane Lawler, and I'll bore you." Lawler halted, facing the door. The door was closed, but a little slide in the upper part of it was open. Through the aperture projected the muzzle of a rifle, and behind the rifle appeared a man's face, dark, bearded, with eyes that gleamed with ferocious malignancy. Chapter 2. Driving a Bargain. Lawler stiffened. There was no mistaking the deadly threat of the rifle and the man's menacing manner. Lawler's face was pale, but his eyes were unwavering as they looked into those that glared out at him through the aperture in the door. Guilt and fear were the emotions that had driven Hamlin to this rather hysterical threat. Lawler resisted an impulse to laugh, though he felt a pulse of grim humor shoot through him. To his knowledge, accepting Hamlin's predilection to rustle cattle, the man was harmless. He never had been known to draw a gun, even in self-defense, and Lawler was convinced that there was not sufficient provocation for him to break one of the rules that had governed him until now. Hamlin might be goaded or frightened into using the rifle, but Lawler had no intention of goading or frightening him. In fact, being aware of the reason for Hamlin's belligerence, he had no intention of acquainting the man with the knowledge of what had happened the night before. At least, not at this instant. Lawler's lips wore a shadowy smile. "I reckon you don't know me, Hamlin," he said. "I know you mighty well, Lawler," snapped Hamlin. "You heard me mention your name. Then you've got a new way of greeting your friends, eh? With a rifle. Well, put it down and open the door. There's some things I want to say to you." "What about?" asked Hamlin suspiciously. Overwhelming every other thought in his mind was the conviction that Davies and Harris had apprised Lawler of what had happened the night before, and that Lawler had come to capture him single-handed. About Ruth. The wild gleam in Hamlin's eyes began to dull. However, he was still suspicious. "You seen any of your men this morning? Davies or Harris?" he asked. "Davies and Harris went to town last night. I reckon they didn't get back yet." "What's Davies and Harris got to do with me visiting you?" "Nothing." There was relief in Hamlin's voice. The muzzle of the rifle wavered. The weapon was withdrawn, and the slide closed. Then the door slowly opened, and Hamlin appeared in it, a six-shooter in hand. "If you're fooling me, Kane Lawler, I'll sure bore you a plenty," he threatened. "Shucks." Lawler advanced to the door, ignoring the heavy pistol, which was shoved close to his body as he walked into the cabin, Hamlin retreating before him. "Hamlin, you're losing whatever sense you had," said Lawler as he halted near the center of the big room. There were 3 rooms, their doors opening from the one in which Lawler and Hamlin stood. "Meanin' what?" demanded Hamlin, nervously fingering the six-shooter. It was clear that Hamlin was impressed with the repressed force that he could see in Lawler, with the slumbering energy that Lawler's lithe, sinewy body suggested, with the man's complete lack of fear, and with the cold confidence that swam in his steady eyes. Hamlin did not know at this minute whether or not he had meant to shoot Lawler. He believed that if Lawler had told him he had come to take him for blotting out the Circle L brand in the arroyo the preceding night, he would have killed Lawler, but he was not sure. Something about Lawler made the thought of shooting him seem ridiculous. It would take a lot of provocation for any man to kill Lawler, for something about Lawler seemed to hint that it couldn't be done, meaning that you are old enough to know that you can't keep on rustling my cattle without getting in trouble. "Ah," exclaimed Hamlin, his breath hissing through his teeth as he sucked it in with a gasp. "You sneaked on me, damn you." He threw the muzzle of the pistol up, his body stiffening, his eyes glittering with the malignance that had been in them when he had been looking out at Lawler through the aperture in the door. "You know about that deal, and you've come for me. You tried to fool me, eh? Telling me that you didn't see Davies and Harris. Well, damn your hide, you ain't going to take me. I'll blow you to hell first." Lawler's eyes were steady and unblinking as he watched Hamlin. They bored into Hamlin's with a compelling intensity that brought a conviction of futility into Hamlin's soul. They were cold eyes, cold as icebergs, Hamlin thought as he watched them, but they seemed to flame also, to flame with a fire that was cold as the ice in them, the terrible power of them and the promise of volcanic action back in them, the awful confidence that shone in them, the threat compelling Hamlin against his will, deadening his muscles, jumbling his thoughts, brought chaos into the man's brain, and he stood, his mouth agape with wonder over the thing that was happening to him, as Lawler walked steadily to him. He made no resistance as Lawler deliberately wrenched the pistol from his hand and as deliberately walked to a side wall and placed it upon a shelf. Hamlin stood, nerveless and pallid, for an instant, watching Lawler's movements, until Lawler turned and faced him again. Then he staggered to a chair and dropped into it, lowering his head dejectedly, sitting with his hands folded, completely subjected. Lawler would hang him now. Lawler would take him to the Circle L and turn him over to Blackburn and the other men of the outfit, and Blackburn would hang him, for Blackburn had told him he would. Or if Lawler didn't take him to Blackburn, he would take him to the sheriff. He would be hanged then, but he would go to the new prison at the Capitol, and Ruth would have to stay on here to do the real suffering for his misdeeds. "You damn fool," came Lawler's voice into the vacuum-like stillness of the cabin. "You haven't got nerve enough to shoot a coyote." Hamlin knew it. He knew now, at least, that he hadn't had nerve enough to shoot Lawler. He cringed under Lawler's contemptuous tone, and then he became aware that Lawler was speaking again. "I'm giving you another chance. I'm letting you off clean, for Ruth's sake. Look here, Hamlin." Hamlin's chin was caught in an iron grasp, and he found himself looking into the terrible eyes. He saw grim pity in the eyes, and he shuddered. Ruth knows you're stealing cattle. Everybody knows it now. Who is buying them? Singleton. Singleton. Lawler's voice snapped with astonishment. Dave Singleton, Leafingwell's old range boss. Hamlin nodded, and then the grip of Lawler's fingers on his chin relaxed. He heard Lawler step back, but he did not lift his head for a few minutes, during which a strained silence descended upon the room. Then he covertly raised his head to see Lawler standing with his arms folded over his chest, watching him. Lawler had not suspected Singleton. Between himself and Singleton, there had always been a lack of ordinary cordiality, a constraint closely approaching dislike. But Lawler had never entertained a suspicion that Leffingwell's range boss was dishonest. Hamlin was a moral weakling, he knew. Everybody in the Wolf River section knew it. Hamlin was lazy and shiftless, seemingly contented to drift along in an aimless way, regardless of what happened to him. There was at Hamlin's feet some of the wealth that other cattlemen of the district were gaining. He had proved on a quarter section of good grass land amid plenty of water, and yet he chose to steal cattle rather than raise them. Lawler's pity for the man was stronger than the resentment he felt. Hamlin was Ruth's father, though looking at him as he sat dejectedly in the chair, Lawler found it hard to discern the relationship. How long has Singleton been buying cattle from you? About a year. I sold him what stock I had before I got to running my brand on other folks' stock, and he hinted he wasn't particular whose cattle I got, long as he could get 'em under the market price. Does Singleton come here? Sometimes, mostly nights. Lawler's quick conclusion was that Ruth must have seen Singleton at the cabin, must have noted that the visits seemed surreptitious. Perhaps she had watched, convincing herself of her father's guilt. Lawler had wondered how she had gained the knowledge she seemed to have, and Singleton's visits must be the explanation. Hamlin had bowed his head again after a swift glance at Lawler. He stiffened when he felt Lawler at his side again, for there had come into the atmosphere of the cabin a premonitory chill which warned him that Lawler was on the verge of action. But he was not prepared for what happened. Lawler's sinewy hands fell on his shoulders. The fingers bit deeply into the flesh, drawing a groan of pain from Hamlin. He was lifted to his feet, off his feet, so that he dangled in the air like a pendulum. He was suspended by the shoulders, Lawler's fingers gripping him like iron hooks. He was shaken until his feet, powerless to retard the movement, were flopping back and forth wildly, and his teeth rattled, despite his efforts to clench them. It seemed to him that Lawler would snap his head from his shoulders, so viciously did Lawler shake him. Then suddenly the terrible fingers relaxed, and Hamlin reeled and swayed, dizzy and weak from the violence of movement. He was trying to keep his feet solidly on the floor when he felt Lawler's fingers at his throat. To his astonishment, the fingers did not sink into the flesh. They touched his throat lightly, and he dazedly met Lawler's eyes, burning with a passion he never had seen in them before. And Lawler's voice was dry and light, but steady, so steady and cold that Hamlin realized that only the man's complete mastery of himself had kept him from committing murder. Hamlin, I ought to kill you. I'm letting you off on one condition, that you break off with Singleton, and that you keep silent about the things we both know. If you confess to Ruth that you've been rustling cattle, or if you tell her, or hint of it, that I know you've been rustling, I'll tear you apart. You're like a lot of other damned weak-kneed polecats. You've got a girl who is good as gold, and you're making a regular hell for her. She's wise to what you've been doing. She suspects you, and from now on, you're going to show her that she was wrong, that you're straight and square. There's a job for you over at the Circle Ale if you want it. I'll throw things in your way. I'll put you on your feet again, give you stock and tools, and pretend I've sold them to you. I'll do anything to keep you square. But if you tell Ruth, I'll kill you, as sure as my name is Lawler. I'm agreein', said Hamlin thickly. I ain't wanted to do the things I've been doin', but things didn't go right. And Singleton, damn it, Lawler, I never liked the man, and I don't know why I've been doin' what I have been doin'. But I've wanted to do something for Ruth, so she could quit teachin' and live like a lady. I thought if I could get a bunch of coin together that maybe she'd have. She'd see you dead before she'd touch it, scoffed Lawler. Maybe I'd be better off if I was dead, said Hamlin glumly. You'll die, right enough, if you don't keep your word to me, grimly declared Lawler. He strode to the door, leaped upon Red King, and rode away. Inside the cabin, Hamlin got to his feet and swayed toward the door, reaching it and looking out to see Lawler riding rapidly toward Willets.